Bankrupt and utterly destroyed by a ruthless divorce, one woman was handed the deed to a rotting, worthless cabin as a final insult. But beneath its floorboards lay a sealed, military-grade vault. The secret inside wasn't just an untraceable fortune. It was the perfect ammunition to crush her ex-husband. The gavel strike in the Manhattan family court felt less like a closure and more like a nail being driven into Clara Harrington's coffin. At 34, she was officially divorced, entirely bankrupt, and utterly humiliated. Her ex-husband, Richard Sterling, sat across the mahogany table, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Tom Ford suit. He didn't even look at her. Richard, a senior partner at a boutique private equity firm on Wall Street, had spent the last 2 years systematically dismantling Clara's life. Through a dizzying web of Delaware shell LLCs and offshore accounts managed by a firm in the Cayman Islands, he had legally hidden their shared wealth. He claimed terrible market losses. He claimed bad investments. The judge bought it, and the prenuptial agreement Clara had naively signed at 24 did the rest. Richard walked away with the Tribeca penthouse, the investment portfolios, and his 23-year-old interior designer girlfriend. Clara walked away with a mountain of legal debt, and the only asset Richard's forensic accountants deemed too worthless to contest: a dilapidated, tax-delinquent Victorian house in the woods of Beacon, New York, bequeathed to her by her estranged grandfather, Arthur Pendleton. Arthur had been a paranoid, reclusive watchmaker who died 5 years prior. Clara hadn't seen him since she was a teenager. Now, his rotting house was her only sanctuary. It was raining the day Clara drove her rattling 2014 Honda Civic up Route 9 toward Beacon. The car's heater was broken, and her breath plumed in the damp October air. When she finally pulled up the overgrown gravel driveway, her heart sank into her stomach. The house was a towering silhouette of peeling grey paint, missing shingles, and rotting porch wood. The yard was a graveyard of rusted machinery parts and overgrown weeds. Taped to the front door was a neon orange notice from Bank of America. Notice of intent to foreclose. Arthur had taken out a reverse mortgage years ago, and the back taxes had piled up to a staggering $84,000. Clara had exactly 30 days to pay it off, or the bank would auction the house, leaving her truly homeless. She pushed open the heavy oak door. The interior smelled of mildew, old newspaper, and stale peppermint. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through dirty windows. The house was a hoarder's paradise. Stacks of yellowed New York Times issues reached the ceiling. Broken clocks, gears, and springs littered every available surface. For 3 days, Clara lived on instant ramen, heated on a camp stove, sleeping in a sleeping bag on the living room floor. She spent her waking hours frantically digging through the mess, praying to find something: a forgotten antique, a stash of silver coins, anything she could sell to pawn shops in town to at least rent a cheap apartment. But it was all junk, worthless, rusted junk. On the 4th afternoon, while clearing out a bizarrely narrow pantry off the kitchen, Clara noticed something strange about the floorboards. They didn't align with the rest of the room. She cleared away a tower of empty Folgers coffee cans and pulled up a stained rug. Beneath it was a heavy wooden trapdoor. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed a rusted crowbar from the porch and pried the trapdoor open, revealing a steep, narrow wooden staircase leading down into pitch blackness. Clara clicked on her phone's flashlight and descended carefully, the wooden steps groaning under her weight. At the bottom, she expected to find a typical damp, dirt floor cellar filled with a water heater and more junk. Instead, the beam of her flashlight hit something that made her stop dead in her tracks. It was a door, but not a normal basement door. It was a massive, commercial-grade, reinforced steel vault door, the kind you would see in the back room of a high-end jewelry store. It was flush with the concrete foundation, secured by a heavy-duty Medeco deadbolt and a rusted combination dial. Surrounding the doorframe was thick, industrial weather stripping. Why would a reclusive, half-blind watchmaker install a bank vault in the basement of a rotting house? Clara ran her fingers over the cold steel. The dial wouldn't budge. She pressed her ear to the metal, hearing nothing but the deafening silence of the house above. A spark of desperate hope ignited in her chest. Arthur was paranoid. Paranoid people didn't build vaults to protect old newspapers. They built vaults to protect things that mattered. But she had no combination, no key, and no money to hire a professional safecracker. The next morning, Clara was jolted awake by the crunch of tires on gravel. She peeked through the dusty living room curtains to see a sleek, black Range Rover parked next to her beat-up Civic. A man in a sharp camel hair coat stepped out, assessing the rotting house with a predatory gaze. Clara stepped onto the porch, pulling her oversized sweater tightly around her. "Can I help you?" The man offered a slick, rehearsed smile. "Clara Harrington. I'm Thomas Griggs. I represent a local real estate development group. We specialize in buying distressed properties for cash." Clara crossed her arms. "The house isn't for sale." "Miss Harrington, let's be realistic," Griggs said, his eyes darting to the orange foreclosure notice on the door. "I know about the bank lien. You have less than a month before they take it. I'm prepared to offer you $40,000 cash today. We take over the debt. You walk away clean. You can start over in the city. $40,000. A week ago, it would have sounded like pennies. Today, it sounded like a lifeline. She could pay off her lawyer, rent a studio in Queens, and breathe. "I need time to think about it," Clara said. Griggs's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. But Clara caught it. He looked past her, toward the side of the house. "I really wouldn't wait long. Structural damage gets worse by the day. Just don't go trying to fix anything yourself. Old houses have hazards." He handed her a glossy business card and got back into his Range Rover. As he drove away, Clara looked down at the card. A developer driving a $100,000 car was personally door-knocking for a worthless, toxic property in the woods. No, he didn't want the land. He wanted the house, and more specifically, he wanted it before the bank took it. He knows about the basement. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Clara bolted to her car and drove straight into town. She found a rundown auto body and welding shop on the edge of Beacon. The owner, a burly, grease-stained man named Miller Hayes, looked skeptical as Clara laid a velvet box on his counter. Inside was a vintage Cartier tank watch, the only piece of jewelry she had managed to hide from Richard's lawyers by claiming she lost it years ago. "I don't need a weld," Clara said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I need you to cut through a reinforced steel door. Today. Keep the watch." Miller picked up the Cartier, examining the gold casing. "Lady, for this, I'll cut through the gates of hell." 2 hours later, Miller was hauling heavy oxygen and acetylene tanks down the groaning wooden stairs. When he saw the vault door, he let out a low whistle. "This is a Mosler-grade anti-drill plate. Whoever put this in didn't want anyone getting inside before the next ice age." "Can you open it?" Clara asked, wiping nervous sweat from her forehead. "The lock?" "No," Miller said, igniting his cutting torch. A bright blue, hissing flame roared to life in the dark stairwell. "But the hinges are external. It'll take me 3 hours and it's going to get hot." Clara sat on the stairs, watching the shower of bright orange sparks rain down as the torch bit into the thick steel. The smell of burning metal and ozone filled the tight space. Her mind raced. What if it was empty? What if Arthur had built it out of pure paranoia, and there was nothing inside but canned beans and madness? Finally, with a deafening crack and a groan of stressed metal, the top hinge gave way. Miller moved to the bottom, his shirt soaked in sweat. 30 minutes later, he kicked the heavy steel door. It screeched, shuddering on its frame, and violently slammed inward, hitting a concrete floor. Clara handed Miller a flashlight. "Thank you. I need to do this alone." Miller nodded, packing up his tanks. "Watch your step, lady. Air's probably stale." Clara stepped over the fallen steel door and into the darkness. She fumbled along the wall, her hand brushing against a heavy plastic switch. She flicked it. Fluorescent tube lights buzzed to life, flickering wildly before stabilizing. Clara gasped. It wasn't a dungeon. It was a pristine, climate-controlled bunker. A heavy-duty industrial dehumidifier sat in the corner, wired directly into a massive silent battery bank. The air smelled of ozone and hot electronics, not rot. Along the left wall were heavy, military-grade metal shelving units. They were lined with vintage radio equipment, massive ham radios, oscilloscopes, and rows upon rows of delicate glass vacuum tubes in protective foam. On the right wall sat a heavy mahogany desk, and on top of it, an archaic Apple IIe computer, thick with a thin layer of dust. But Clara's eyes were drawn immediately to the center of the room. Resting on a concrete pedestal was a vintage, heavy iron safe. Her hands trembled as she approached it. This was it. The fortune. The reason Richard would rue the day he left her with this house. She reached out to grab the heavy brass handle. It was loose. Clara pulled. The safe door swung open effortlessly. She shined her flashlight inside. It was completely, utterly empty. Not a coin, not a paper, not a single trace of anything valuable. Just bare steel. Clara sank to her knees, the cold concrete biting into her skin. A sob tore from her throat, echoing in the sterile room. It was a joke, a cruel, cosmic joke. She had traded her last valuable possession to break into a tomb of obsolete electronics and an empty safe. Griggs, the developer, probably knew the safe was empty and just wanted the vintage radio equipment, or the bunker itself for some prepper client. Tears streamed down her face as she leaned against the mahogany desk, burying her face in her hands. As she did, her elbow caught the edge of a plastic storage tray perched precariously on the desk. The tray crashed to the floor, sending dozens of glass vacuum tubes shattering across the concrete. Clara cursed, scrambling to pick up the broken glass. As she swept the shards into a pile, something caught the harsh fluorescent light. It wasn't glass. It was a small, heavy cylinder, wrapped tightly in oilcloth, that had been hidden inside the hollow casing of one of the large, broken amplifier tubes. Frowning, Clara picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy. She peeled back the sticky, age-hardened oilcloth to reveal a brushed titanium canister, no larger than a roll of quarters. She unscrewed the cap. A small cascade of velvet spilled into her palm. She unrolled the dark fabric. Clara stopped breathing. Resting in the center of the velvet were 5 stones. They weren't just diamonds. They were large, flawlessly cut, vividly colored diamonds. 2 deep sapphire blues, a brilliant canary yellow, and 1 astonishingly clear pink diamond the size of a quail egg. They caught the cheap fluorescent light and fractured it into a blinding, fiery rainbow that danced across the bunker walls. Even without an appraisal, Clara knew she was holding millions of dollars in the palm of her hand. Untraceable, highly liquid, absolute wealth. She let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. She wasn't bankrupt. She was rich beyond her wildest dreams. Then, the heavy thud of a footstep echoed from the kitchen floorboards directly above her. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. Miller had left an hour ago. She was supposed to be alone. Another footstep. Slow. Deliberate. And it was moving toward the pantry door. The heavy thud of a footstep echoed from the kitchen floorboards directly above her. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. Miller, the welder, had left an hour ago. She was supposed to be alone. Another footstep. Slow. Deliberate. The floorboards groaned under a heavy weight, and the sound was moving deliberately toward the pantry door. Panic, sharp and cold, pierced her chest. Clara's hands moved on pure instinct. She shoved the titanium canister deep into the front pocket of her jeans, the cold metal pressing sharply against her hip. She kicked the crumpled oilcloth and the remaining shards of the vacuum tube under the heavy mahogany desk, plunging the empty velvet cloth into her other pocket. The rusted hinges of the trap door squealed overhead. A blinding beam of white light from a high-lumen tactical flashlight sliced through the dusty air of the stairwell, sweeping down the wooden steps and hitting the severed steel vault door. "Well, well," a smooth, chillingly familiar voice echoed down the concrete walls. "You've been busy, Clara." The man descended into the bunker. It was Thomas Griggs. The camel hair coat and the polished real estate developer facade were gone. He wore a dark, utilitarian jacket, leather gloves, and in his right hand, resting casually against his thigh, was a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP compact pistol. Clara backed up against the metal shelving, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Griggs, what are you doing here? I'll call the police." Griggs chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He stepped over the fallen vault door, sweeping his flashlight over the vintage radios and the gaping, empty safe. "With what cell service, Clara? We're a mile off the main road, in a concrete box. And please, drop the Griggs Act. My name is Thomas. Yes, but I don't buy distressed properties. I fix distressed situations, mostly for men who have too much to lose." The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. "Richard, your ex-husband is a very thorough man," Thomas said, stepping closer, his eyes scanning the empty shelves. "He never quite believed your grandfather died penniless. Arthur Pendleton was one of the top horologists in the world during the 80s. He crafted custom million-dollar timepieces for Saudi royals and Swiss oligarchs, all off the books. When he died, his bank accounts were empty. Richard knew the money went somewhere. He let you have this rotting house because it kept you distracted, but he hired me to keep an eye on the property." Thomas paused, his eyes narrowing, as he looked at the violently cracked safe. "I saw the welder's truck leave. I figured you finally found it. But looking at this safe, it seems you're just as broke as you were yesterday." He leveled the gun at her chest. The casualness of the gesture made Clara's stomach turn. "Where is it, Clara? I know a Mosler safe wasn't guarding vintage ham radios. Whatever was in there, hand it over, and I'll let you drive that pathetic Honda back to Manhattan. Richard gets the inheritance. You get your life. A fair trade." Clara's mind raced. If he knew she had diamonds, he would kill her. You don't bring a suppressed weapon to a robbery if you plan on leaving witnesses. He thought the safe had held ledgers, or cash, or gold. It was empty, Clara lied, her voice surprisingly steady. She gestured to the open iron door. "Look for yourself. Arthur was insane, Thomas. He built a bunker for nothing. There is nothing here." Thomas's jaw tightened. He took a step toward the safe, his flashlight sweeping the dusty interior. For a fraction of a second, his attention wavered. Clara didn't hesitate. Beside her, resting on the edge of the metal shelving unit, was a massive, vintage oscilloscope, 40 pounds of heavy steel casing and cathode ray glass. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, Clara grabbed the machine with both hands and shoved it off the shelf directly at Thomas. The heavy equipment crashed into him, sending him stumbling backward. The tactical flashlight dropped, rolling across the concrete floor and casting dizzying, spinning shadows across the bunker walls. The gun went off, a muffled pft, and a bullet sparked against the concrete wall inches from Clara's head. She didn't wait to see if he recovered. Clara bolted. She scrambled over the fallen steel vault door, her boots slipping on the metal, and threw herself up the narrow wooden stairs. "Clara!" Thomas roared from the darkness below, the sound of breaking glass and scrambling footsteps echoing behind her. She reached the top of the stairs, slammed the heavy wooden trapdoor shut, and dragged the towering stack of Folger's coffee cans and old newspapers over the wood. It wouldn't hold him long, but it was enough. Clara ran out the front door, the damp autumn air hitting her lungs like ice. She threw herself into the driver's seat of the Civic, jammed the key into the ignition, and prayed. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. She slammed it into reverse, tires spinning wildly in the wet gravel, and tore down the driveway just as Thomas burst through the front door of the house, his gun raised. She ducked low over the steering wheel as she hit the paved road, flooring the accelerator. She didn't look back until she was miles away, merging onto the I-84 freeway. Only then, with the city skyline approaching in the distance, did she reach into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold titanium canister. She had survived, and now she had the ammunition to destroy them both. 3 days later, Clara sat in a hyper-secure, windowless appraisal room on the 14th floor of a towering high-rise in Manhattan's Diamond District. The brass plaque on the door read, "Solomon and Klein, Fine Gemology." Across from her sat Ezra Klein, a third-generation master gemologist with a loupe pressed to his eye. The tension in the room was palpable. For 20 minutes, Ezra had examined the 5 stones under harsh, specialized lighting, using microscopic tweezers to turn them with agonizing precision. Finally, he set the tweezers down and let out a long, shaky breath. He took off his thick-rimmed glasses and looked at Clara, his expression a mix of awe and deep suspicion. "Ms. Harrington," Ezra began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where on earth did you acquire these?" "They were a family inheritance," Clara said smoothly, leaning back in the plush leather chair. "Are they real?" Ezra let out a sharp laugh. "Real? Ms. Harrington, they are spectacular. The 2 sapphires are untreated cashmere stones, easily 60 carats between them. The canary yellow is flawless. But the pink—" He pointed a trembling finger at the quail egg-sized diamond. "This is a Type 2A, fancy vivid pink. Stones of this clarity and saturation haven't been mined in a century. It rivals the pink star. Off the record, I have clients in Dubai and Geneva who would commit unspeakable acts to add this to their collections." Clara's heart hammered, but she kept her face an impassive mask. "Give me a number, Ezra." "For the collection?" Ezra wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "At a private, discreet auction. $32 million. Conservatively." $32 million. The number echoed in Clara's head, entirely reshaping her reality. Richard had left her with $84,000 in debt and a rotting house. Arthur had left her an empire in her pocket. "I need them sold," Clara said, her voice turning to steel. "Quietly, offshore accounts. I want the funds routed through a trust in the Cayman Islands, heavily layered. And I need a $2 million cash advance by tomorrow morning." Ezra smiled, recognizing a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. "Consider it done," 6 months later, the Manhattan skyline glittered under a crisp spring night. Richard Sterling sat in his corner office at his boutique firm, staring at his Bloomberg terminal in absolute horror. Over the past 3 weeks, an anonymous holding company named Pendleton Vanguard, LLC, had been systematically buying up the debt of Richard's firm. Through aggressive, ruthless legal maneuvering, this phantom company had triggered a hostile takeover, exploiting the very Delaware shell loopholes Richard had used to hide his wealth during his divorce. Worse, all of Richard's personal offshore accounts, the ones he had illegally hidden from the family court, had been anonymously leaked to the IRS and the SEC. His accounts were frozen. His firm was bleeding out. His interior designer girlfriend had packed her bags 3 days ago when the federal subpoenas arrived. The intercom on his desk buzzed. "Mr. Sterling," his terrified assistant whispered. "The new majority shareholder of the firm is here to see you." Richard straightened his tie, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "Send them in." The heavy glass doors swung open. Clara walked in. She was unrecognizable from the broken, sobbing woman in the family courtroom. She wore a stunning, sharply tailored, midnight blue Alexander McQueen suit. Her hair was flawlessly styled, and on her right hand, catching the city lights, was a stunning cashmere sapphire ring. Behind her stood a team of 3 severe-looking corporate lawyers. Richard's face drained of all color. He fell back into his executive chair, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "Clara." "What? What are you doing here?" "Good evening, Richard," Clara said, her heels clicking authoritatively on the hardwood floor as she approached his desk. She didn't sit. She looked down at him, savoring the absolute terror in his eyes. "I believe we have some restructuring to discuss." "You," Richard stammered, his eyes darting to her lawyers. "Your Pendleton Vanguard? How? You were bankrupt. You had nothing." "I had Arthur's house," Clara corrected gently, a razor-sharp smile playing on her lips. "And as it turns out, Arthur wasn't quite as destitute as your forensic accountants believed. It's amazing what you can find when you look past the surface." Richard's eyes widened in horror. "The basement, Griggs." "Oh, Thomas Griggs is currently serving a 3 to 5 year sentence in a federal penitentiary," Clara interrupted smoothly. "Turns out the ATF doesn't look kindly on unregistered, suppressed firearms. He was very eager to offer up your name in exchange for a plea deal regarding who hired him to intimidate me." Richard looked like he was going to be sick. He gripped the edge of his desk. "Clara, please. We were married. We loved each other once. You can't do this. You've frozen my accounts. You've taken the firm. What more do you want?" Clara leaned over the desk, placing her hands flat on the polished mahogany. Her face was inches from his. "I want the Tribeca penthouse." "Richard," she whispered, her voice laced with absolute venom. "I bought the note from your private lender this morning. You are over-leveraged, in default, and entirely bankrupt. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises, or the bank will forcefully evict you." She stood back up, smoothing her suit jacket. "Oh, and Richard, don't bother trying to take any of the furniture. I've already had it legally catalogued. Enjoy starting over." Clara turned on her heel and walked out of the office, her lawyers trailing behind her like wolves. She stepped into the private elevator, the doors sliding shut on the ruined shell of her ex-husband. As the elevator descended toward the bustling streets of Manhattan, Clara Harrington looked at her reflection in the polished brass doors and smiled. She had broken the seal, and she had claimed her crown. Did Clara's ruthless revenge satisfy you? Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in our darkest moments, waiting for us to break the seal and claim our power. If this story of brutal betrayal, hidden wealth, and ultimate payback kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling real-life dramas.